I am reading, there's no chapter number, the chapter called Dreams from the BFG. There's a picture. The lens isn't working, so I have no idea. Hopefully that worked. The big friendly giant was seated at the great table in his cave, and he was doing his homework. Sophie sat cross-legged on the table nearby, watching him at work. The glass jar containing the one and only good dream that they had caught that day stood between them. The BFG, with great care and patience, was printing something on a piece of paper with an enormous pencil. "What are you writing?" Sophie asked. "Every dream is having its special label on the bottle," the BFG said. "How else could I be finding the one that I am wanting in a hurry?" "But can you really truly tell what sort of a dream it's going to be simply by listening to it?" Sophie asked. "I can," the BFG said, not looking up. "But how? Is it by the way it hums or buzzes?" You is less or more right," said the BFG. "Every dream in the world is making a different sort of buzzy hum music, and these grand swashbuckling ears of mine is able to read that music." By music do you mean tunes?" "I is not meaning tunes." Then what do you mean?" "Human beings is having their own music, right or left." "All right," Sophie said, "lots of music." "And sometimes human beings is very overcome when they is hearing wondrous music. They is getting shivers down their spindles, right or left." "Right," said Sophie. "So the music is saying something to them. It is sending a message. I do not think the human beings is knowing what the message is, but they is loving it just the same." That's about right," Sophie said. "But just because those jump swiffling ears of mine, these jump swiffling ears of mine," the BFG said, "I is not only able to hear the music that dreams is making, but I is understanding it also." "What do you mean, understanding it?" Sophie asked. "I can read it," the BFG said. "It talks to me. It is like a language." "I find that just a little hard to believe," Sophie said. "I'll bet it is also finding it hard to believe in quadwinkles," the BFG said, "and how they is visiting us from the stars." "Of course I don't believe that," Sophie said. The BFG regarded her gravely with those huge eyes of his. "I hope you will forgive me," he said, "if I tell you that human beings is thinking they think is very clever, but they is not. They is truly all of them not muchers and squeak pips." "I beg your pardon," Sophie said. "The matter of human beings," the BFG went on, "is they is absolutely refusing to believe in anything unless they is actually seeing it right in front of their own schnozzles. Of course, quadwinkles is existing. I is meeting them very often. I is even chittering to them." He turned away contemptuously from Sophie and resumed his writing. Sophie moved over to read what he had written so far. The letters were printed big and bold, and they were not very well formed. Here is what she read. "This dream is about how I is saving my teacher from drowning. I is diving into the river from a high bridge, and I is dragging my teacher to the bank, and then I is giving him the kiss of death." "The kiss of what?" Sophie asked. The BFG stopped writing and raised his head slowly. And there's a picture of the kiss of death with the teacher. So he raised his head slowly. His eyes rested on Sophie's face. I is telling you once before, he said quietly, that I is never having a chance to go to school. I is full of mistakes. They is not my fault. I does my best. You is a lovely little girl, but please remember that you is not exactly Miss Know Everything yourself. I'm sorry, Sophie said. I really am. It is very rude of me to keep correcting you. The BFG gazed at her for a while longer, and then he bent his head again in his slow, laborious writing. Tell me honestly, Sophie said, if you blew this dream into my bedroom when I was asleep, would I really and truly start dreaming about how I saved my teacher from drowning by diving off the bridge? More, the BFG said. A lot more. But I cannot be scribbling the whole flunkin' dream on a titchy bit of paper. Of course there is more. The BFG laid down his pencil and placed one massive ear close to the jar. For about 30 seconds he listened intently. Yes, he said, nodding his great head solemnly up and down. This dream is continuing very nice. It has a very dorky hunky ending. How does it end? Sophie said. Please tell me. You would be dreaming, the BFG said, that the morning after you is saving the teacher from the river, you is arriving at school and you is seeing all the 500 pupils sitting in the assembly hall and all the teachers as well. And the head teacher is then standing up and saying, is wanting the whole school to give 3 cheers for Sophie because she is so brave and is saving the life of our fine arithmetic teacher, Mr. Figgins, who was unfortunately pushed off the bridge into the river by our own gym teacher, Miss Amelia Upscotch. So 3 cheers for Sophie. And the whole school is then like cheering like mad and shouting, Bravo, well done. And forever after that, even when you is getting your sums all gung swizzled and muggled up, Mr. Figgins is always giving you 10 out of 10 and writing good work, Sophie, in your exercise book. Then you is waking up. I like that dream, Sophie said. Oh, of course you like it, the BFG said. It is a fizz wizard. He licked the back of his label and he stuck it on the jar. I is usually writing a bit more than this on the labels, he said, but you is watching me and making me jumpsy. I'll go and sit somewhere else, Sophie said. Don't go, he said. Look in the jar carefully, and I think you will be seeing this dream. Sophie peered into the jar, and there, sure enough, she saw the faint translucent outline of something about the size of a hen's egg. There was just a touch of color in it, a pale sea green, soft and shimmering and very beautiful. Daisy! Daisy! Shh. Daisy's barking. Okay. There it lay, this small, oblong, sea green, jellyish thing at the bottom of the jar, quite peacefully, but pulsing gently, the whole of it moving in and out ever so slightly, as though it were breathing. Oh my gosh, she won't be quiet. It's moving, Sophie cried. It's alive. Oh, of course it's alive. I'm going to shut the door. What will you be feeding it? Sophie asked. It's not needing any food, the BFG told her. That's cruel, Sophie said. Everything alive needs some sort, needs food of some sort, even trees and plants. The north wind is alive, the BFG said, and it is moving. It touches you on the cheek and on the hands, but nobody is feeding it. Sophie was silent. This extraordinary giant was disturbing her ideas. He seemed to be leading her toward mysteries that were beyond her understanding. A dream does not mean anything, the BFG went on. If it is a good one, it is waiting peaceably forever until it is released and allowed to do its job. If it is a bad one, it is always fighting to get out. The BFG stood up and he walked over to one of the many shelves and placed the latest jar among the thousands of others. Please, can I see some of the other dreams? Sophie asked. The BFG hesitated. Nobody has ever seen them before, he said. But perhaps after all, I is letting you have a little peep. He picked her up off the table and stood her on the palm of one of his huge hands, and he carefully carried her toward the shelves. Over here is some of the good dreams, he said. The fizz wizards. Would you hold me closer so I can read the labels, Sophie said. My labels is only telling bits of it, the BFG said. The dreams is usually much longer. The label is just to remind me. Sophie started to read the labels. The first one seemed long enough to her. It went right around the jar, and as she read it, she had to keep turning the jar, and this is what it said. Today, I am sitting in class, and I discovered that if I am staring very hard at my teacher in a special way, I is able to put her to sleep. So I keep staring at her, and in the end, her head drops onto her desk, and then she goes fast to sleep and snorkles loudly. Then in marches the head teacher, and he shouts, Wake up, Mrs. Plumridge! How dare you go to sleep in class? Go fetch your hat and coat, and leave this school forever. You is sacked. But in a jiffy, I is putting the head teacher to sleep as well, and then he just crumbles slowly, to the floor like a lump of jelly, and there he lies in all in a heap, and starts snorkeling even louder than Miss Plumridge. And then I is hearing my mommy's voice saying, Wake up, your breakfast is ready. What a funny dream, Sophie said. It's a ring beller, the BFG said. It's a whoopsie. Inside the jar, just below the edge of the label, Sophie could see the putting to sleep dream lying peacefully. There's the head teacher asleep. She could see the dream, putting to sleep dream, lying peacefully on the bottom, pulsing gently, sea green like the other one, perhaps a trifle larger. Do you have separate dreams for boys or for girls? Sophie asked. Oh, of course, the BFG said. If I is given a girl's dream to a boy, even if it was a really whoopsie girl's dream, the boy would be waking up thinking what a rat-bungling, grink-sludging old dream that was. Boys would, Sophie said. These here is all girls' dreams on this shelf, the BFG said. Could I read a boy's dream? You can, the BFG said, and he lifted her to a higher shelf. The label on the nearest boy's dream jar read as follows. I is making myself a marvelous pair of suction boots, and when I put them on, I is able to walk straight up the kitchen's walls and across the ceiling. Well, I am walking upside down on the ceiling when my big sister comes in and she is starting to yell at me as she always does, yelling, What on earth is you doing up there walking on the ceiling? And I looks down at her and I smiles and I says, I told you you was driving me up the wall and now you has done it. I find that one rather silly, Sophie said. Boys wouldn't, the BFG said, grinning. That's another ring beller. Perhaps you have seen enough now. Let me read another boy's one, Sophie said. It's a picture. The next label said, The telephone rings in our house, and my father picks it up and says in his very important telephone voice, Simpkins speaking? Then his face goes white and his voice goes all funny, and he says, What? Who? And then he says, Yes, sir. I understand, sir. Surely it's me you is wishing to speak to, sir, not my little son. My father's face is going from white to dark purple, and he is gulping like he has a lobster stuck in his throat. And then at last he is saying, yes, sir, very well, sir, I will get him, sir. And he turns to me and he says in a rather respectful voice, is you knowing the President of the United States? And I says, no, but I expects he is hearing about me. And then I is having a long talk on the phone and saying things like, let me take care of it, Mr. President. You'll bungle it all the way up if you do it your way. And my father's eyes is googling right out of his head. And that is when I is hearing my father's real voice saying, get up, you lazy slob, or you will be late for school. Boys are crazy, Sophie said. Let me read the next one. And Sophie started reading the next label. I is having a bath, and I is discovering that if I press quite hard on my belly button, a funny feeling comes over me, and suddenly my leg is not there, nor is my arms. In fact, I has become absolutely invisible all over. I is still there, but no one can see me, not even myself. So my mommy comes in and she says, where is that child? He was in the bath a minute ago and he can't possibly have washed himself properly. So I says, here I is. And she says, where? And I says, here. And she says, where? And I say, here. And she yells, Henry, come up quick. And when my daddy rushes in, I is washing myself, and my daddy sees the soap floating around in the air. But of course, he is not seeing me. And he shouts, where are you, boy? And I say, here. And he says, where? And I says, here. And he says, where? And I says, here. And he says, it's in the air. And I says, what? And he says, the soap, boy, the soap is flying in the air. Then I press my belly button again, and now I is visible. My daddy is quiffy with excitement, and he says, you is the invisible boy. And I says, now I is going to have some fun. So when I is out of the bath and I has dried myself, I put on my dressing gown and slippers and I press my belly button again to become invisible. And I go down into the town and I walk in the streets. Of course, only me is invisible, but not the things I is wearing. So when people see a dressing gown and slippers floating along the street with nobody in it, there is a panic with everybody yelling, a ghost, a ghost! And people is screaming left and right, and big strong policemen is running for their lives. And best of all, I see Mr. Grummet, my algebra teacher, coming out of a pub. And I float up to him and I say, boo! And he lets out a frightsome howl and he dashes back into the pub. And then I is walking up and feeling happy as a wiffle squiddler. Pretty ridiculous, Sophie said. All the same, she couldn't resist reaching out and pressing her own belly button to see if it worked. Nothing happened. Dreams is a very mystical thing, the BFG said. Human beings is not understanding them at all. Not even their brainiest professors is understanding them. Has you seen enough? Oh, just this last one, Sophie said. This one here. And she started reading. I has written a book, and it is so exciting nobody can put it down. As soon as you has read the first line, you is so hooked on it you cannot stop until the last page. In all the cities, people is walking in the streets bumping into each other because their faces is buried in my book. and dentist is reading it and trying to fill teeth at the same time. But nobody minds because they all is reading it too in the dentist chair. Drivers is reading it while driving, and cars is crashing all over the country. Brain surgeons is reading it while they're operating on brains. And airline pilots is reading it and going to Timbuktu instead of London. Football players is reading it on the field because they can't put it down. And so is Olympic runners while they is running. Everybody has to see what is going to happen next in my book. And when I wake up, I is still tingling with excitement at being the greatest writer the world has ever known. Until my mommy comes in and says, I was looking at your English exercise book last night. And really, your spelling is atrocious. So is your pronun, pun, it's supposed to be pronunciation, but it's punt, punctuation. Your punctuation. That is enough for now, the BFG said. There is jillions more, but my arm is getting tired holding you up. What are all those over there? Sophie asked. Why have they got such tiny labels? That, the BFG said, is because one day I is catching so many dreams, I is not having the time or energy to write out long labels. But there is enough to remind me. Can I look? Sophie said. The long-suffering BFG carried her across to the jars she was pointing to. Sophie read them rapidly, one after the other. I is climbing Mount Everlast with just my pussycat for company. I is inventing a car that runs on toothpaste. I is able to make the electric lights go on and off just by wishing it. I is only an 8-year-old little boy, but I is growing a splendid bushy beard, and all the other boys are jealous. I is able to jump out of any high window and float down safely. I has a pet bee that makes rock and roll music when it flies. What amazes me, Sophie said, is how you ever learned to write in the first place. Ah, said the BFG, I has been wondering how long it is before you is asking me that. Considering you never went to school, I think it's quite marvelous, Sophie said. How did you learn? The BFG crossed the cave and opened a tiny secret door in the wall. He took out a book, very old and tattered. By human standards, it was an ordinary-sized book, but it looked like a postage stamp in his huge hand. One night, he said, I is blowing a dream through a window, and I sees this book lying on the little boy's bedroom table. I wanted it so badly, you understand, but I is refusing to steal it. I would never do that. So how'd you get it? Sophie asked. I borrowed it, the BFG said, smiling a little. Just for a short time, I borrowed it. How long have you had it? Sophie asked. Oh, perhaps only about 80 years, said the BFG. Oh, soon I shall be putting it back. And that's how you taught yourself to write? Sophie asked. I is reading it hundreds of times, BFG said, and I is still reading it and teaching new words to myself and how to write them. It is the most scrumptious story. Sophie took the book out of his hand. Nicholas Nickleby, she read. By Doll's Chicken, BFG said. By who? Said Sophie. Just then there came a tremendous noise of galloping feet from outside the cave. What's that? Sophie cried. That is the giant zip-fizzing off to another country to guzzle human beings, the BFG said. He quickly popped Sophie into his vest pocket, and then he hurried to the cave entrance and rolled back the stone. Sophie peeped out of her spy hole and saw all 9 of the fearsome giants coming past at a full gallop. "Where is you off to tonight?" shouted the BFG. "We is all of us flesh bunkin' off to England tonight," answered the lump eater as they went galloping past. "England is a luscious land, and we is fancying a few nice little English chidlers." "I," shouted the maid masher, "is knowin' where there is a giggle house for girls, and I is guzzlin' myself full as a froth blower." "And I knows where there is a boggle box of boys," shouted the gizzard gulper, "and all I have to do is reach in and grab myself a handful. English boys is tastin' extra lickwishy." In a few seconds, the 9 galloping giants were out of sight. "What did he mean?" Sophie said, poking her head out of the pocket. What is a giggle house for girls?" "He means a girls' school," said the BFG. "He will be eating them by the bundle." "Oh, no," cried Sophie. "And boys from boys' schools," said the BFG. "It mustn't happen," Sophie cried out. "We've got to stop them. We can't just sit here and do nothing." "There's not a thing we can do," said the BFG. "We is helpless as horse feathers." He sat down on a large craggy blue rock near the entrance of his cave. He took Sophie from his pocket and put her beside him on the rock. "It is now quite safe for you to be outside until they is coming back," he said. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and it was getting dark. That is the end of the chapter Dreams.